Okay, so good morning, N1K. So today is August 29, 2022, Monday. And since it is a holiday, excuse me, so I have decided no, to record a lecture on chapter 3. It's about the cell structure and their function. Okay, it's our topic not supposed to be for today, but because it's a holiday, no, so that we will not be forced to compress two topics, chapters 3 and 4, next Monday, no, I have decided to record this lecture. Okay, so therefore, on next Monday, no, we will have a quiz regarding chapters 1 and chapter 3. Okay, so this topic will be included in our quiz next Monday. So let us start our discussion. Okay, so as discussed in your laboratory, no, the cell structure is composed basically of three main parts, and those are the organelles, the cytoplasm, and the cell membrane. The organelles are the small structures or organs, because when we say organelles, it means small organs. These are the small organs inside the cell that floats in the cytoplasm. And each organelle perform specific function. And it was discussed to you in the laboratory. Example of organelles inside the cell is your nucleus, no? Your endoplasmic reticulum, your mitochondria, and your Golgi apparatus, and many more organelles. And you already know, no, the specific functions of those organelles because it was discussed to you in the laboratory. Now, the second primary part of the cell is your cytoplasm. This is the jelly-like substance that is found inside the cell, and that is where the organelles are afloat. So mainly it supports, no, the organelles inside your cell. And lastly, you have the cell membrane. Cell membrane is the outer envelope of the cell, which separates the intracellular space from the extracellular space. Ha? Yan yung naghihiwalay from the intracellular and extracellular substances. And because the cell membrane is selectively permeable, no? Selective, okay? No? The composition of the intracellular and the extracellular space is very, very different because not all substances from the outside of the cell can readily go inside. Let me just use a pointer. Yeah. Not all substances from the outside of the cell can readily go inside. And at the same time, not all substances from the inside of the cell can readily go outside. Again, it is because of the presence of this selective barrier. Okay, it selects, no? That's the reason why it is described as selectively permeable. It selects substances, no, that will be allowed to go inside and also to go outside. So the basic cell structure, as I have said, again, is composed of organelles. These are the small organs inside the cell performing their specific functions. By the way, no, the organelles, no, the specific organelles present inside the cell depends on its structure and function. What you are seeing right now is a generalized structure of a cell wherein all of the features and organelles that can be found in all of the types of cells inside the body, no, are found in this drawing. Kasi this is a generalized cell. No? So ang mga cells natin, hindi pare-pareho. No? Na, okay, lahat yan ng organelles na yan, makikita mo. No? Like for example, there are cells that have fewer mitochondria, for example. No? There are cells that have fewer rough endoplasmic reticulum or fewer ribosomes. Again, the presence of specific organelles inside the cell depends on its structure and function. Okay? So, second, again, you have your cytoplasm, the gel-like substance, no, where the organelles are floating. And finally, you have the cell membrane, no, which functions as the outer envelope of the cell. It is a selective barrier, no, that, okay, determines the substances that can enter the cell and also that can move out of the cell. As a result, you have different composition of substances in the inside and also on the outside of the cell. Okay? Now, so what are the different functions, no, of the cell? As we have said, no, in our orientation, no, for chapter 1, no, cells are considered as the smallest unit of life. It's the basic unit of all living organisms. Second, okay, no, it is used, no, mainly for cell metabolism in energy use. Meaning, our metabolic process, the metabolism of the body, and also the energy use and energy production of the body takes place at the cellular level. Okay? No? So, doon nangyayari ang ating metabolism, no? At our cellular level. Ha? And when we say metabolism, no, it is divided into two pathways. The catabolic pathways and the anabolic pathways, as you can see in the illustration. That is why cell metabolism is composed of catabolism, that's the other name for the catabolic pathway, and your anabolism, that's the other name for the anabolic pathway. So catabolism is, when, okay, the substances from the food that we eat is broken down into smaller particles, such as the cellular building blocks, in order to produce energy. That is the catabolic pathway or catabolism. When we break down the food that we eat into smaller particles and use it for the production of energy. While when we say anabolism is when we use those building blocks coming from catabolism, building blocks that are produced by the catabolism to form other larger molecules or yung tinatawag nating macromolecules, and that is called anabolism. Like for example, yung mga, di ba, yung mga food that we eat, okay, can be divided into three, di ba? Based on your elementary science, you have your go, glow, and grow food. Okay? Yung grow food, yung grow na group, okay, it makes use of the anabolic pathway so that we can use those macromolecules for us to grow. Kaya tayo lumalaki, kaya lumalaki ang muscles, for example, is because, di ba, yung mga weightlifters, kailangan nilang kumain ng mayaman sa protein so that they can produce, okay, more macromolecules for their muscles. And that process is called anabolism. So again, cell metabolism have two pathways, the catabolic pathway and the anabolic pathway. Again, catabolic pathway is when we break down the food that we eat into smaller particles. And it is broken down into cellular building blocks. No? And the energy and also heat production. Now, when we use those smaller building blocks to produce larger macromolecules or other forms of molecules, that is called anabolism. So that is metabolism in general. Okay? So cells are also produced, no, to synthesize molecules. As we will be discussing later, no, in this topic, no, there are a lot of molecules that are synthesized inside the cell. In fact, the anabolic pathway, no, of cellular metabolism, okay, the way, no, the macromolecules are produced, okay, is a form of synthesis. Huh? Another function of the cell is for communication. And most importantly, cells are important for reproduction and inheritance. No? When we say reproduction, okay, no? When, no, parents produce their own offspring, di ba? That is reproduction. And it takes place at the cellular level. And when the offsprings inherit the traits, no, of their parents, okay, that happens also. Ang tawag nga pala doon, no, when the offsprings inherit the traits of their parents, that's called inheritance. And it also takes place at the cellular level. So those are the different functions of the cell. Okay, so let's take up these three, no, basic structures inside the cell. And let's start with the cell membrane. No? Let's discuss ano bang itsura ng cell membrane. So sabi natin, cell membrane is the outer envelope, no, of the cell, which acts as a selective barrier between the inside or the intracellular space and the extracellular space. Okay. So, no? So the cell membrane, no, is also known as the plasma membrane. No? And it is the outermost component of the cell. That is what we have been mentioning, no, earlier. And it forms a boundary between the material in the inside the cell and the outside of the cell. Oh, and we also mentioned these terms already earlier, intracellular and extracellular. Intra, inside, no? Extra, outside. And as we have said, it acts as a selective barrier. And when we say selective barrier, oh, we mentioned already earlier, no? Meaning the substances that are allowed to move from the extra to the intracellular space and vice versa are just selective substances. Okay? No? Are just selected substances, rather. Okay, let us continue. Okay? So if we will take a closer look, no, let's say for example, no, we will get, no, a portion of the cell membrane, no, and enlarged it, no, using a high power microscope. Okay? Itong makikita natin. No? Ayan ang makikita natin when we enlarge the cell membrane. So as you can see, no? Okay? Uh, um, ito yung tinatawag nila na fluid mosaic model, no, of the cell membrane. It is the model used to describe the structure of the cell membrane. And in this fluid mosaic model, okay, it is composed of phospholipids, no? Cholesterol, and proteins and carbohydrates. Okay? No? Yung kulay blue na nakikita natin, yung napakaraming kulay blue na yan, no? Yung mga kulay blue na yan, these are the phospholipids. Ha? And as you can see, phospholipids form a bilayer in the cell membrane. That is why it is described as a lipid bilayer. Ha? Kasi dalawa eh. Dalawa yung layers niya eh. Layer 1, no? And then you have your layer 2. That's why it's described as a lipid bilayer. Now, itong phospholipids na to, no, contains two regions. This is what is Doc Step is telling you in our laboratory class. No? What are those two regions? Your polar region, okay? Sa kabilang side, may polar region ka din. And then, on the inner side, you have your non-polar region. So, i-discuss natin. No? Ano ba yung polar? Ano yung non-polar? Kasi, ang phospholipid molecule, let's say for example, let's take for example, kuha tayo ng isang phospholipid molecule. Ayan, this one. Ayan. A phospholipid molecule, no, is composed of a head and a tail. Now, as you can see, meron siyang isang head, meron siyang dalawang tail. Okay? Now, the head region of the phospholipid molecule is considered to be no, hydrophilic. Kaya nakaharap siya or it is exposed no, to the water around the membrane. The outside of the cell no, has water. The inside of the cell also has water. And since the heads of the phospholipid molecules are hydrophilic, meaning water-loving. They face towards where water is found. And where is water found? You have water on the outside, extracellular space. And you also water on the inside, intracellular space. Okay? Now, tapos, okay, na, while yun namang non-polar, no? Okay, is the tail. No? The tails of the phospholipids is non-polar, and it is described to be hydrophobic. And when we say hydrophobic, no, they are water-fearing. No, ayaw nila sa tubig. And that is the reason why, no, okay, the tails are facing the interior of the membrane. If this is a bipolar, or if this is a bilipid layer, the space located in between the bilipid layer is the interior of the membrane. And that is where you find the tails no, are facing. So that is how this lipid bilayer is oriented, no? Or is arranged in our cell membrane. Kaya sa tinawag na lipid bilayer. Now, okay, no? As we have said earlier, no, the cell membrane, okay, acts as the selective barrier between the inside and the outside, between the intra and the extracellular space. No? Meaning, it is selectively permeable. And when we say selectively permeable, it allows only certain substances to pass in and out of the cell. And that is why, as we have said earlier, the outside of the cell has a different composition as compared to the inside. Now, substances such as enzymes, glycogen, potassium are found in higher concentrations inside the cell. So, anong mas marami sa loob? Enzymes, glycogen, and potassium. While substances such as sodium, calcium, chloride are found in higher concentrations outside. So remember that. Huh? You have sodium, calcium, and chloride, no? Found in higher concentrations outside of the cell, while enzymes, glycogen, and potassium, no, are found in higher concentrations inside the cell. Why? Again, because the cell is selectively permeable. Okay? Now, the cell membrane, rather, is selectively permeable. Okay. While some substances like oxygen, carbon dioxide can pass directly, no, through the cell membrane's phospholipid bilayer. Ibig sabihin, itong mga substances na to, unlike those that we have mentioned earlier, yung mga enzymes, glycogen, potassium, no, yung mga sodium, calcium, and chloride, selective ang cell membrane sa kanila, no? Oxygen and carbon dioxide can directly pass, no, through the cell membrane's phospholipid bilayer. Okay? Dire-diretso lang sila, no? Substances must pass through transmembrane protein channels, no, such as sodium, no, through its channels. That is why if you will look at the cell membrane, no, interspersed through this lipid bilayer. Ito yung nakita niyo to. Itong kulay red na to is an example of membrane channel. And if you will look at this membrane channel, no, it's like an open doorway, no, which will allow substances to pass through in and out of the cell. And there are substances, no, that must pass through those transmembrane protein channels. Okay? So, tawag doon, transmembrane protein channels. Because they are made up mainly of protein. And one of those channels is a sodium channel, which allows sodium specifically to pass through. Now, the route of transport through the membrane, okay, depends on the size, shape, and charge of the substance. Okay? Meaning, no, the way a substance will be transported, no, across the membrane, again, depends on three factors, no? The size, the shape, and the charge of the substance. And when we say charge of the substance, no, it is either a positive charge or a negative charge. Like, for example, in the case of sodium, no, it is positively charged. Okay. While some substances will require carrier molecules to transport them across the cell membrane. No? Example is yung glucose molecule. That is why, if you will go back to the structure of the cell membrane, aside from membrane channels, no? Okay, you also have carrier molecules, no? Ang carrier molecules naman, no? Kapag pumasok dyan or dumikit dyan ang isang substance, it will transform so that, no, that substance will be transported inside the cell, no? Hindi siya naka-open, but a chemical change will take place once that substance to be transported, no, binds on its receptor. A carrier molecule have receptors. Okay? Yun. No? So, some substances requires carrier molecules such as glucose, while some substances require vesicular transport across the membrane. Okay? So, when we say vesicular transport, no, a vesicle must fuse within the cell membrane for transport. And we will discuss that in detail later. Okay? So, as I've said earlier, okay? So, substances like oxygen and carbon dioxide, they pass directly through the cell membrane's phospholipid bilayer. In short, tumatagos sila readily through the cell membrane. So, in short, imagine the cell membrane as a wall separating the inside and the outside of the room. Oxygen and carbon dioxide simply diffuse across that wall without effort. Tumatagos lang sila. While substances such as sodium, again, must pass through using protein channels. Okay? And some substances like glucose require naman carrier molecules. So what is the difference between a carrier molecule and a protein channel? Yung protein channel, as we have said, balik tayo dito sa drawing, pinto talaga siya. May lagusan. Okay? While a carrier molecule is a molecule when the substance to be transported fuses to its receptor, it will undergo chemical change so that yung substance to be transported will be transferred to the other side of the cell membrane. Okay? And lastly, some substances require vesicular transport across the membrane. So moving on, the way or the methods by which those substances move across the cell membrane can be divided into two kinds of transport. You have your passive membrane transport and your active membrane transport. The passive membrane transport does not require the cell to expend energy. Okay? Okay, what is the energy currency of the cell? Diba? We said that it is adenosine triphosphate. So therefore, when we say passive membrane transport, it does not require the cell to use ATP or adenosine triphosphate. While active membrane transport requires the cell to expend energy, again, in the form of ATP. So let us try to discuss, let's enumerate muna the examples of passive transports and active transport. Passive transport mechanisms include diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. So these are the specific types of passive transport mechanisms that happens across the cell membrane. Okay? So while under active transport mechanism naman, you have active transport, you have secondary active transport, and then you have your endocytosis and exocytosis. Okay, so let's discuss them in detail, starting with passive membrane transport mechanisms, specifically diffusion. Okay, so what is diffusion? Diffusion is the movement of substances in a solution, down a concentration gradient. Okay, So merong medyo terms that is needed to be defined first here, Kasi ulitin natin, diffusion involves the movement of substances in a solution down a concentration gradient. So therefore, what is a solution? A solution is generally composed of two major parts, solutes and solvent. Okay? What are solutes? Oh, solutes are substances dissolved in a predominant liquid or gas, which is called the solvent. Okay? Now, uh, solutes such as ions or molecules tend to move from an area of higher concentration no, to an area of lower concentration. Okay, so balikan muna natin. What are solutes? Solutes are substances dissolved in a predominant liquid or gas. Like for example, no, yung kulay blue in the background, for example, is water. Okay? While these, okay, uh, substances, no, or molecules suspended, no, on water is the solute. Yung water, yung kulay blue in the background, is the solvent. Huh? Like for example, if this is salt solution, okay, those molecules suspended are the salt molecules. While the blue background, where salt is dissolved, is the solvent, which is water. Okay? And then imagine that this is a semi-permeable or selectively permeable membrane, just like your cell membrane. In diffusion, solutes move from areas of higher concentration to areas of lower concentration. Just like what you see in this picture, di ba? This side of the membrane has more solutes. Therefore, it has higher concentration of the solute. Okay, like for example, if it's a salt solution, this side of the membrane has more salt, salt molecules, while this side of the membrane has less salt molecule. This side has higher concentration, while this side has lower concentration. Okay? Now, when solutes move from higher concentration to lower concentration, it is called diffusion. As you can see, no, in the animation, no? Okay? Yan. Okay? So nagsimula sila na unequal, di ba? Kanina madami dito, konti dito. Okay? During diffusion, no, there is movement of substances in a solution down a concentration gradient. Okay? And when we say concentration gradient, it is the difference in the concentration of a solute in a solvent between 2 points divided by the distance between the 2 points. It is the difference. So, kung makikita mo, sabi nila, anong definition? Concentration gradient. The keyword is the difference in the concentration. Okay? So, dito po ba sa picture, is there a difference in the concentration of the solutes on the two sides of the membrane? Yes. Therefore, if there is a difference in the concentration of the solutes, is there a concentration gradient? Yes. Di ba? No? Mas mataas dito, mas mababa dito. So therefore, no, the movement of substances will be from higher concentration to lower concentration. Just like what you see in the animation. Okay? No? And the concentration gradient is said to be steeper when the concentration difference is large and or the distance is small. Okay? So, let us continue. Another example. So, this is a more simplified example of diffusion. So, as you can see, when you drop a block of salt, or salt cube in distilled water, a concentration gradient exists between the salt, no? Okay, from the salt crystal and the water in the beaker. Siyempre, when you drop it, mas concentrated muna dito sa area na to, yung salt molecules. But as the salt molecules are being dissolved, di ba? The molecules, okay, the small dots, move down their concentration gradients then into the water. If initially there is higher concentration here and lower concentration, no, on the other parts of the beaker, so the salt molecules now move from areas of higher concentration to lower concentration until such time that the salt molecules or salt ions are distributed evenly all throughout the solution. Again, that's called simple diffusion, no? Or diffusion. Now, the second type, no? Tapos na tayo sa diffusion. Yan. So let's go to the second type of passive transport, which is osmosis. Yan. Ano naman ang osmosis? Okay? If in simple diffusion, no? Okay? What is diffusing or moving is the solute, no? Yung solute, ha? Okay? Now, in osmosis, what diffuses is water or the solvent. O, baliktad naman ngayon, no? What will move across the membrane is water or solvent rather than the solute, no? Or the salt, for example, in the case of our example that we used earlier. No? It is the movement or diffusion of water, which is a solvent, across a selectively permeable membrane from a region of higher water concentration to a region of lower concentration. Okay? So, but in order for osmosis to happen, in order for diffusion of water or any solvent to happen, no, there must be an osmotic pressure. No? Okay? It is the pressure exerted by osmosis. It's called osmotic pressure. And osmotic pressure, no, is the force required to prevent the movement of water across the cell membrane. So let us discuss that in detail. Okay. No? So let's say, for example, okay. No? So let us enlarge first yung okay. No? Sige, wag na nating enlarge. Teka, enlarge na nga natin para mas makita nyo. Yan. Yan. Okay. Let's say, for example, no, you have a 3% no, salt solution no, placed on a cylinder. Okay? No? So when we say 3% salt solution, that's 3% salt no, plus water, no, distilled water. Now, the bottom of this cylinder no, is actually open and it is just covered with a selectively permeable membrane, just like our cell membrane. Okay? So, itong selectively permeable membrane na to will allow only water to pass through, but not salt. Okay? So, again, no, that cylinder or tube contains 3% of salt solution. Okay? Tapos, again, it is being closed only with a selectively permeable membrane. Now, when you submerge that solution, no, okay, no, into a beaker containing only distilled water, okay, because the tube contains salt ions, no, which is represented by those medium pink, no, and large green spheres, as well as water molecules, no, small blue spheres. There is proportionately less water in the tube, di ba? No? Than in the beaker, which contains only water. Di ba? O, mas maraming tubig dito sa labas kaysa doon sa loob. Di ba? Okay? So therefore, ano sabi natin sa diffusion? Di ba? Diffusion is the movement of substances from higher to lower concentration. And we defined osmosis as diffusion of water. So therefore, what will happen here? If you will look at the direction of the arrow, no? Okay? Water moves or diffuse, no, down their concentration gradient. Mula sa labas, papasok sa loob through that selectively permeable membrane. Papasukin ng tubig yan. Kasi mas konti yung tubig sa loob. As a result, the level of the solution, if this is the initial level of the solution, okay, during osmosis, upon submersion of the tube, the level of water inside the tube rises, signifying that more water is going inside that tube. Okay? Because the salt ions cannot leave the tube, the total fluid volume inside the tube increases and the fluid moves up the glass tube as a result of osmosis. So, ang resulta, no, tumaas yung level ng tubig sa loob. Bakit? Kasi nga, water moved inside the tube through the selectively permeable membrane. Di ba? Through the process of osmosis. Now, will water, no, tuloy-tuloy ba yung pagpasok ng tubig? No. Okay? The solution stops rising. Ayan. Di ba? No? When the weight of the water column already prevents further movement of the water into the tube by osmosis. So what is the difference between simple diffusion and osmosis? Ulitin natin, when we say simple diffusion, which component of the solution diffuses? It's your solute. No? It's the solute. While in osmosis, which component of the solution diffuses? It's the solvent. No? It's the solvent. Okay? But the direction of diffusion will always be from higher to lower concentration. So let us continue. So that is osmosis. Okay. Ngayon, sabi natin, di ba? Osmosis takes place because of osmotic pressure. And osmotic pressure depends on the difference of solution concentration inside a cell relative to the outside of the cell. Again, it depends on the difference of solution concentrations inside a cell relative to the outside of the cell. Okay? So, a cell may be placed in solutions that are either hypotonic, isotonic, or hypertonic compared to the cell cytoplasm. So, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? So, for example, no? Okay, if this is a cell, okay, if this is the cell, okay, no? Solutions where you place the cell, no, solutions where you submerge the cell, ah, can either be hypotonic, isotonic, or hypertonic compared to their cytoplasm. Okay. If a cell is submerged into a solution that have the same composition, no, of what is in the cytoplasm, kung anong nandito sa loob, ganun din ang nandito sa labas. They have the same concentration, no? They have the same tonicity. Then therefore, this substance where the cell is submerged is said to be isotonic. Iso means same. Okay? Now, same kasi pareho sila ng tonicity, pareho sila ng concentration. Now, when a cell is submerged inside a solution, for example, that has less tonicity or less concentration than what is found in the cytoplasm, then this solution is said to be hypotonic. Hypotonic. No? And if the solution found here in the outside of the cell, no, has greater concentration and has greater tonicity as compared to what is found in the cytoplasm sa loob, this solution is said to be hypertonic. Kasi greater. So again, if the outside is the same as the tonicity of the inside, they are said to be isotonic. Same tonicity, same concentration. If the outside has lower tonicity or lesser concentration, that is what is found in the cytoplasm, it is said to be hypotonic. And if the outside of the cell has greater concentration, greater tonicity as compared to what is found in the cytoplasm, then the solution in the outside of the cell is said to be hypertonic. Okay? So, a hypotonic solution, as I have said earlier, has a lower concentration of solutes and a higher concentration of water relative to the cytoplasm of the cell. The solution has less tone or osmotic pressure than the cell. Okay? So therefore, it's like, for example, this is a cell, and this is a beaker containing a hypotonic solution. Okay. Now, okay. So, for example, this is one good example of a hypotonic solution is distilled water. For example, yung beaker contains distilled water. Distilled water, it does not contain any solute. It contains purely water. Di ba? Kaya ang pinakamagandang pure water talaga, distilled water. Di ba? Kaya nga yan ang ginagamit as for the formula, milk formula, di ba, of infants. Ang preferred talaga distilled water. No? Because it does not contain any solute. It contains purely water. So therefore, distilled water is considered a hypotonic solution because it contains more water and less solutes relative to the cytoplasm of the cell. So what will happen if you will submerge the cell, no, into that distilled water? Yan, no? how will water, no, diffuse based on what we have discussed, no, in osmosis. Paano magdi-diffuse ngayon ng water? Di ba? Water will move from area of more water to area of less water. Di ba? So, ibig sabihin, water will move inside the cell. No? Yan. Causing it to swell and eventually rupture, a process called lysis. Pumasok yung tubig eh. Di ba? O, di lalaki yung cell, magsuswell yan. That is what will happen if it is placed in a hypotonic solution. Now, if a cell, no? Okay, drawing natin ulit yung same beaker, no? Wherein yung cell is submerged into a beaker containing a solution that has the same tonicity as what is found inside the cytoplasm of the cell. Parehong-pareho sila ng tonicity. Parehong-pareho sila ng concentration. Di ba? No? Pareho. Same. Parehong-pareho. Kaya nga sabi, isotonic. So therefore, there will be no net movement of water to the inside or to the outside of the cell. So therefore, the cell will neither shrink nor swell because it is said to be isotonic. No? The cell will remain. The cell will remain the same or normal. Okay? No? One very good example, no, of an isotonic solution is our plasma. Ayan, no. Yung plasma natin, no, or yung serum, no, the plasma of our blood, the liquid portion of your blood, no, is called plasma. And that is where your red blood cells are suspended. This is your red blood cells. Ayan, no. And the liquid portion of the blood where the red blood cells are suspended. Okay? Now, the tonicity or the concentration of the plasma has the same tonicity or concentration of the inside of the red blood cells. And that is the reason why your red blood cells do not shrink nor swell while it is floating or flowing inside our plasma. Okay, just imagine if your plasma is hypotonic. Just imagine if your plasma is replaced with distilled water. Diba? What will happen to your red blood cells? Diba? Through the process of osmosis, water will enter your red blood cells and it will swell and will rupture or burst in the process called lysis. Now, lastly, drawing natin ulit. Ayan. Okay. If the cell is placed in a solution, kunyari, yan yung cell. Okay. If the cell is placed or submerged in a solution which is more tonic or more concentrated than what is found in the cytoplasm, mas marami siyang solutes, ibig sabihin, than water. Okay? When you submerge the cell inside that solution, okay, then what will happen? How will water move by osmosis? The water inside the cell will move out going into this hypertonic solution. Lalabas ngayon yung tubig. from inside the cell, pupunta dun sa solution where you submerged it. Okay? Water moves by osmosis from the cell into the hypertonic solution. Eh, di nabawasan ng tubig sa loob ng cell natin. Therefore, the cell will shrink. And that process of cell shrinking or shrinkage is called crenation. And that is what will happen if you place the cell under a or in a hypertonic solution. So this is the summary of what we have just discussed. When you place the cell in an isotonic solution, it will remain normal. Because there will be no net movement of water inside and outside of the cell. When you place the cell in a hypotonic solution, like for example, a distilled water, water will move to the inside of the cell. Okay? The cell will swell and eventually burst into cell lysis. When you move the cell into a hypertonic solution, the cell will shrink because water may move outside of the cell because of that hypertonic solution. So if you are injected with pure distilled water through your veins, you know what will happen to your cell membrane or to your cell itself. You are injected with a hypertonic solution through your veins, you know what will happen to your red blood cells. That is why most of the IV fluids that are used, that are injected to us through IV line, where medications are passed through, these are isotonic solutions in order to ensure that your cells will remain normal. Okay? Sige. Let us continue. So, we are finished with, balik muna tayo dito. We are finished with diffusion and osmosis. Now, let us discuss facilitated diffusion. Ayan. Okay. So, lipid-soluble substances such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, and steroids can diffuse directly through the phospholipid bilayer. Sinabi natin kanina yan, di ba? Imagine that the phospholipid bilayer is a wall, okay? Oxygen and carbon dioxide, directly pass through the wall. Tumatagos sila doon sa wall na yun. Okay? So they just simply diffuse across that phospholipid bilayer. But other water-soluble substances, such as ions, can diffuse across the cell membrane only by passing through cell membrane channels or carrier molecules. Kaya nga sabi natin kanina, itong si sodium, dumadaan siya sa channel. Samantalang yung si glucose, as we have said earlier, it requires a carrier molecule to be able to pass through the cell membrane. Okay? Because they cannot readily just diffuse, natatagos, like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and steroid. So, ibig sabihin, si oxygen, carbon dioxide, steroid, does not need these membrane channels or carrier molecules. They just diffuse by simple diffusion. So, when we say facilitated diffusion, it is a carrier-mediated transport process that moves substances across the cell membrane from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration of that substance. So there is one common denominator between simple diffusion or diffusion and facilitated diffusion. Ano yun? Pareho sila na the direction of movement of the substance. For example, ito yung substance na yun. Tapos, for example, ito yung cell membrane. Okay? Then on this side of the cell membrane, you only have a fewer number of that substance. Okay? Pareho sila, no? Si simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion. No? Okay? Their common denominator is that, no? In both types of diffusion, the substance move from higher to lower concentration. They move down their concentration gradient. Okay, the only difference is that, as we have said earlier, for molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide, they simply diffuse across the cell membrane by just simply passing through, as if tumatago sila sa pader. Yun ang simple diffusion. But in the case of glucose, sodium, yan, no? They need a carrier. That's why their transport is carrier mediated. And that is called facilitated diffusion. But they also move from higher concentration to lower concentration. Okay? So therefore, since the movement is still downhill, no? Downhill meaning, no? From higher to lower concentration, it still does not need to use the energy coming from ATP because the movement is still passive. So, this is what I'm telling you about. No? Pag simple diffusion, yan, they simply diffuse across the cell membrane as if tumatagos lang. Pag facilitated diffusion, they will need membrane channel or carrier molecules to be able to pass through the cell membrane. But their common denominator is that the movement of substances is downhill or through their concentration gradient. Okay? So, channels on the cell membrane. So, anong sabi natin? Kapag facilitated diffusion, it makes use of either a channel or a carrier molecule. Discuss natin yung channel. What is a channel? Sabi natin, a channel, no, parang pinto. Ayan. Para siyang pinto, nalagusan. No? That's a channel. Now, there are two classes of membrane channels that you will find in the cell membrane. These are leak channels, leak, and gated channels. Leak channels are constantly open, meaning they are always open. And they allow ions to pass through or simply to leak depending on their concentration gradient. No? Kung mas marami sila sa labas, mas konti sa loob, what would be the direction of the leakage? The direction of the leakage of the molecules is from the outside to the inside. Kung mas marami naman sila sa loob, mas konti sa labas, then the direction of the leakage will be from the inside to the outside. Again, it is always down the concentration gradient. And it will continuously happen because leakage channels or leak channels are always open. Kaya nga, the keyword there is constantly. Gated channels limit the movement of ions across the cell membrane by opening and closing. Hence the name gated. And when we say gated, it is not always open. No? It requires a particular stimulus, no, to open. Para mabuksan ang gated channel, a particular stimulus is needed, no, para siya ay mabuksan. Okay? So let us continue. Okay. So this is what I'm telling you about. No? In the cell membrane, okay? Now, example, you have a potassium leakage channel or potassium leak channel. A potassium leak channel is always open. So therefore, it will allow continuous leakage of potassium going into the outside of the cell. While a sodium-gated channel, like for example here, a gated sodium channel, no? Okay? Initially, pwedeng sarado siya. But it will open in response to a particular stimulus, like for example, by the binding of certain chemicals on its receptor. As you can see, a sodium channel has receptor on its gate, and it opens only when a particular chemical binds on its receptor. Oh, ganun ang gated. A certain stimulus is needed in order for it to open. Okay? While a leak channel is always open. Okay? Now, so we're finished with channels. So, again, kasi di ba, in facilitated diffusion, it makes use of either a channel or no, a carrier molecule in order for those substances to move down their concentration gradient. So carrier molecules are proteins within the cell membrane, again, involved in facilitated diffusion. Okay? So, ang carrier molecule, they exhibit specificity. Only specific molecules are transported by carriers. Example niyan, no? Sabi natin kanina, di ba, yung glucose. No? Ang glucose, no, enter the cell using carrier molecule. And as we have said earlier, no, since it is specific, only glucose molecules can be transported by glucose carrier substances or glucose carrier across the cell membrane. Specific yan. Ito ay para sa glucose lang. Glucose lang ang pwedeng ma-transport dyan, papasok ng cell. Okay? Yeah. So we are finished with yung passive transport. Tayo dito sa unang slide natin. Sabi kasi natin, passive transport mechanisms include diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. Yan. Dito naman tayo sa active membrane transport mechanisms. Ano-ano yun? Active transport, secondary active transport, and endocytosis and exocytosis. Okay. Yan. Okay. So active transport. The first type of active transport mechanism is active transport. So active transport is a carrier-mediated process. Kailangan din yan ng carrier, no, on the cell membrane, to be able to move those substances, no, across the cell membrane. Okay? But the difference between active transport and facilitated diffusion, kasi di ba yung facilitated diffusion, gumagamit din siya ng carrier molecule. Ang pagkakaiba, since facilitated diffusion moves substances down their concentration gradient, they do not require ATP. Sa active transport, they require ATP. Kailangan ng energy. Bakit? Because the movement of substances is uphill. Oh, uphill. Pakontra ka, no? No, dinadala mo yung substances from lower to higher lalo. So you tend to accumulate substances on one side of the cell membrane. Like for example, if this is the cell membrane, this is the inside and this is the outside. Okay? If you have fewer sodium here and you have more sodium here on the outside, mas marami kang sodium dito sa labas, ang active transport mechanism, ang ginagawa niya, mas dinadala pa niya yung ibang sodium palabas. Okay, mas mahirap 'yon, no? Kasi you tend to go against the concentration gradient and you tend to accumulate those substances on one side of the membrane. So therefore, to be able to do that, you need energy coming from ATP. So, as I have said earlier, active transport processes accumulate necessary substances one side of the cell membrane at concentrations many times greater than those on the other side. And to be able to do that, you must go against the gradient or uphill. And to be able to do that, you need energy coming from ATP. Ganun ang active transport. ATP is needed to be able to accomplish that. Okay? And one very good example of an active transport mechanism inside the cell is your sodium-potassium exchange pump. If this is the cell membrane, for example, and this is your sodium-potassium exchange pump, okay? And this is the outside, for example, and this is the inside of the cell. The sodium-potassium pump, para hindi nyo makalimutan, does the piso. Yan. Piso. Potassium in, okay, sodium out. Potassium in, sodium out. Oh, anong ibig sabihin? Yung sodium, ipinapump niya palabas. Yung potassium, ipinapump niya papasok. Kaya, potassium in, sodium out. So therefore, in the case of sodium, for example, di sa nag-accumulate ang sodium sa labas. Doon maraming sodium sa labas. At marami na nga yung sodium, tuloy-tuloy pa rin yung ginagawa yun. Pinapump pa rin niya yung sodium sa labas. So this pump is actually going against the concentration gradient. And the sodium-potassium pump is powered by ATP to be able to do that. Okay? So the sodium-potassium exchange pump is a very good example of an active transport process. Now, so this is what I'm telling you about. Ayan. So as you can see, in this illustration, this is your sodium-potassium pump. Ayan yung sinasabi nating piso kanina. Potassium in. Kasi going into the interior of the cell. And you have 2 molecules of potassium in exchange of 3 molecules of sodium going outside of the cell. And to be able for this pump to function, okay, there is the need for ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Okay? So, natapos natin yung active transport. Yan. Example na active transport, again, is yung sodium-potassium exchange pump. Now, secondary active transport uses the energy. Ito naman, pangalawa, is your secondary active transport. Secondary active transport uses the energy provided by a concentration gradient established by the active transport of one substance, such as sodium, to transport other substances. No? So here, no additional energy is required. No? Okay? Above the energy provided by the initial active transport pump. Okay? Now, meron tayong two types, no, of secondary active transport. You have what you call your co-transport and your counter transport. Okay? So as the name implies, in co-transport, the diffusing substance move in the same direction as the initial active transported substance. Anong ibig sabihin nun? No? Okay. While in counter transport, the diffusing substance move in a direction opposite to that of the initial active transport substance. Kung titingnan niyo yung keywords dito, co-transport, same direction. Counter transport, in the opposite direction. Anong ibig sabihin nun? Okay. Unahin natin yung co-transport. Yan. Okay. So, aside from the sodium-potassium pump, exchange pump, that is present in the cell membrane, no, nasabi nga natin kanina, it actively pumps sodium out and potassium inside the cell. Anong ginagawa ni sodium-potassium pump? It accumulates sodium outside of the cell. Napakaraming sodium sa labas. So it already has established a concentration gradient for sodium. Diba? Now, aside from the sodium-potassium pump, there is also a carrier molecule on the cell membrane known as the sodium glucose co-transport molecule. Again, the sodium, sodium glucose co-transport. Diba? Okay. So dito, no, ang nangyayari dyan, since sodium has been accumulated outside of the cell, sinong nag-accumulate? Si sodium-potassium pump. Diba? There is this tendency now for most of that sodium to go back into the inside of the cell. Kasi ang dami na nila sa labas eh. So ang gradient na ngayon nila papasok. Diba? Ang dami nila sa labas eh. Now, when these sodium molecules, no, pass through this carrier molecule, which is called the sodium glucose co-transport. Since it is a co-transport, no, it will carry with it glucose molecules as it enter the cell. Okay? So, and take a look at the direction, no, of their transport. Pareho silang papasok. That's why it's called sodium glucose co-transport. Now, the question is, no, to be able to transport glucose inside the cell, nag-require ba ng ATP? Hindi. Hindi gumamit ng ATP. Because this is working, no? This transport mechanism is working because of the sodium concentration gradient that has been previously established by the primary active transport, which is your sodium-potassium exchange pump. So therefore, if this is the primary active transport, anong tawag mo dito? Naggumagana lang siya because of the gradient that has been established for sodium. This is considered a secondary active transport. What specific type of secondary active transport? It's called sodium glucose co-transport. Bakit tinawag na sodium glucose cotransport? Because as sodium moves into the cell, huh, down its concentration gradient, it carries with it glucose molecules. And this is just secondary active transport. Bakit secondary? Kasi when the sodium-potassium exchange pump stops from working, what do you think will happen to sodium glucose cotransport? Di ba? Do you think it will still continue to work? After a period of time, this will also stop from working. Because, no, yung sodium na nasa labas, eventually, di mauubos yung sodium na nasa labas. Therefore, sodium can no longer move down its concentration gradient in this sodium glucose cotransport. So therefore, makakapasok pa ba ang glucose if that happens? No. Because, again, glucose is just co-transported with sodium. Hence the name sodium glucose co-transport. So that's one type of secondary active transport. It is highly dependent on the primary active transport, which is your sodium potassium exchange pump. Okay? Now, the other type of active transport mechanism is called endocytosis. Endo means inside. Endo means inside. So therefore, it is a process that brings material into a cell or into the cell using vesicles. Meaning, if this is the cell, and these are the materials that has to be brought inside the cell, to be able to be brought inside, pagpasok niyan sa loob, those materials will be enclosed inside membranous structures. And those membranous structures that encloses those substances that are transported inside the cell is called a vesicle. Okay? Now, ngayon, there are two types of endocytosis. Phagocytosis and pinocytosis. Phagocytosis is used when solid particles are ingested. While pinocytosis, no, is used when smaller vesicles are formed because, no, okay, they contain liquid rather than solid particles. What is being engulfed or transported inside the cell is liquid rather than solid. That's why in the past, phagocytosis is considered as cell-eating, while pinocytosis is described as cell-drinking. Okay? So, okay. The opposite of endocytosis is exocytosis. Exocytosis, gumagamit din ng vesicles, specifically called secretory vesicles, okay, that accumulate materials inside the cell and they will be released to the outside of the cell. The vesicles move to the cell membrane and fuse, ultimately releasing the material by exocytosis. For example, this is the cell, and these are your secretory vesicles. Nandun sa loob ngayon yung substance, okay, that accumulate inside those secretory vesicles. When those secretory vesicles move towards the end or they fuse on the cell membrane, they create an opening on the cell membrane where they can readily release those substances outside of the cell through the process of exocytosis. So kung yung endocytosis papasok, exocytosis palabas. Examples of that are those digestive enzymes secreted by the cells in our digestive system. Okay? Yan, that is the example. Ayan ang secretory vesicle. Nasa loob siya ng cell. And this is the cell membrane, for example. When they start to fuse on the cell membrane, they create an opening on the cell membrane, causing the release of the contents of the secretory vesicle. Again, that's called exocytosis. Okay? So that ends the first half of our lecture. Okay? So, ikakat ko muna dito so that the recording will not be a very lengthy. It will be divided into two para yung file size niya will be not as very large, so that it will be easier for me to upload it and share it to you. Okay. So, I will cut the lecture muna, okay, in this part. Okay.